I'm Gemma Owens, 29, and I rose from a small-town family to become the youngest Rear Admiral in Navy history. For decades, I sacrificed everything for my sister Sarah, my money, my time, my unwavering loyalty. But when she grabbed the microphone at her own wedding and publicly humiliated me, calling me a deadbeat in front of 300 guests, I made a decision that shocked everyone. Have you ever been completely betrayed by someone you'd move mountains for? If so, share your story below. You're definitely not alone. Quick question, where are you watching from? And if you've ever had to choose self-respect over family loyalty, smash that like button and subscribe for more real stories about standing up when it matters most. What happened next? Let's just say 250 Navy SEALs had something to say about it. Growing up, Sarah was everything I wasn't. 3 years older, effortlessly popular, the kind of girl who could walk into any room and command attention without trying. I was the serious one, the quiet one, the one who spent her evenings with textbooks while Sarah painted her nails and planned her social calendar. Our parents loved us both, but Sarah had always been the sun around which our family orbited. I didn't resent it then. I admired her. When she needed help with math homework, I stayed up late explaining equations until she understood. When she wanted to go to concerts but didn't have money, I emptied my babysitting earnings without hesitation. When she got into trouble for sneaking out, I covered for her, creating elaborate alibis that kept her out of serious consequences. "You're such a good sister, Gemma," she'd say, hugging me tight after I'd saved her from another scrape. Those words meant everything to me. I thought we were a team. The pattern continued through high school and college. Sarah studied communications at a state school while I earned a full scholarship to the Naval Academy. The discipline appealed to me, the structure, the honor code, the sense of purpose. Sarah thought it was weird. "You're going to be ordering people around on boats." She'd laugh when friends asked what her sister was doing. But she was proud too, I think, when I graduated with honors and received my commission. My first deployment took me to the Persian Gulf. Sarah was in her senior year then, struggling with her thesis and a complicated relationship with a guy named Marcus. I spent hours on satellite phone calls, helping her organize her thoughts, listening to her cry about Marcus, sending care packages filled with her favorite snacks and encouraging notes. When she couldn't afford her spring break trip to Cancun, I wired her $1,000 from my deployment savings. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she told me during one of those long-distance conversations. The connection was scratchy, but her gratitude came through clear. I made lieutenant faster than most. Then lieutenant commander. Each promotion meant more responsibility, longer hours, harder decisions. But I always made time for Sarah. When she moved to Los Angeles to pursue acting, I helped her with rent during the lean months. When she got food poisoning from a bad audition lunch and ended up in the emergency room alone, I flew out on my leave to take care of her. Sarah never quite found her footing in LA. The acting work was sporadic, mostly commercial spots and background roles. She waited tables at trendy restaurants, always convinced her big break was just around the corner. I never questioned her dreams or suggested she might want a backup plan. I just kept being there when she needed me. By the time I made commander, Sarah had been in LA for 6 years. She'd found a steady relationship with a guy named Derek who worked in film production. He was successful enough to afford a nice apartment in Santa Monica, and Sarah seemed happier than she'd been in years. When she called to tell me they were engaged, I was genuinely thrilled for her. "I want you to be my maid of honor," she said. I can't imagine anyone else standing up there with me. Of course I said yes. Of course I threw myself into wedding planning with the same dedication I brought to military operations. I organized her bridal shower, coordinated with vendors, helped her choose flowers and music. When Derek's family proved difficult about guest lists and seating arrangements, I spent hours on the phone mediating disputes. When Sarah's dress didn't fit properly 2 weeks before the wedding, I drove across town to the seamstress 3 times to ensure the alterations were perfect. Sarah seemed grateful for all of it, but there was something different in her manner. A distance that hadn't been there before. When I asked about it, she brushed me off. "I'm just stressed about the wedding," she'd say. "You know how crazy this all is." I attributed it to pre-wedding jitters. Every bride gets overwhelmed. I just kept doing what I'd always done, taking care of the details so she could focus on being happy. The week before the wedding, I was promoted to captain. It was a significant milestone, one I'd worked toward for years. When I called Sarah to share the news, her response was lukewarm. "That's nice, Em. Listen, I'm dealing with a flower crisis right now. Can we talk later?" We never did talk about it later. In the rush of final wedding preparations, my promotion got lost. I told myself it didn't matter. This was Sarah's week, her moment. My achievements could wait. The night before the wedding, during the rehearsal dinner, I noticed how Sarah introduced me to Derek's friends and family. "This is my sister Gemma," she'd say. "She's in the military." Never mentioning my rank, never acknowledging what I'd accomplished. When someone asked what I did in the Navy, Sarah would joke, "Oh, she pushes papers around on ships somewhere." I felt the sting of it, but I didn't say anything. Tomorrow was her wedding day. Tomorrow was supposed to be perfect for her. I could swallow my pride for one more day. Looking back now, I realized that was the moment I should have recognized what was happening. The woman who used to brag about having a sister at the Naval Academy now seemed almost embarrassed by my career. But I was so focused on making her day beautiful that I missed all the signs of what was coming. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright. As I helped Sarah into her dress and arranged her veil, she seemed nervous but radiant. For a moment, she was my big sister again, the one who used to let me brush her hair while she told me about her dreams. "Thank you for everything," she said, squeezing my hand. "I mean it, Em. All of this, I couldn't have done it without you." I believed her. I wanted to believe her. Even as I was starting to notice the way she'd changed, I still thought we were the same team we'd always been. I should have known better. I should have seen what Derek's world was doing to her, how it was reshaping her values and priorities. But I was still the little sister who just wanted to make Sarah proud, still the woman who thought loyalty and sacrifice were always rewarded with love and gratitude. The ceremony was beautiful. Sarah looked stunning. Derek seemed genuinely happy. As I stood beside her at the altar, holding her bouquet and watching her promise to love and honor the man beside her, I felt proud of what we'd accomplished together. This perfect day was the result of months of planning, countless hours of preparation, and the kind of sisterly devotion I'd always believed would never go unappreciated. During the reception dinner, while guests enjoyed the meal I'd helped select and the flowers I'd arranged, I allowed myself to feel satisfied. Whatever distance had crept between Sarah and me lately would surely disappear now. We'd get back to being sisters again, the way we'd always been. But Derek's friends were different from the people we'd grown up with. They talked about money in ways that made me uncomfortable, about status and appearances, and who was worth knowing. As the evening progressed, I watched Sarah laughing at their jokes, agreeing with their opinions, becoming someone I barely recognized. When the best man made his toast, he joked about Sarah trading up from her simple family background. The comment stung, but I told myself he was just being thoughtless. Rich people often said things without thinking about how they sounded. Sarah laughed along with everyone else. That should have been my final warning. But I was still operating under the old assumptions about who we were to each other. I still believed that blood was thicker than social climbing, that the sister who had once called me her hero would never betray that bond. As the evening wore on and the champagne flowed, I began to sense something building. The way Sarah's new friends looked at me, whispered among themselves, made small comments about military people being intense and rigid. The way Derek's mother kept asking pointed questions about my lifestyle choices and when I planned to settle down properly. I should have left then. I should have made my excuses, congratulated the happy couple, and gotten out before the evening took its inevitable turn. But I stayed, partly out of loyalty and partly out of a stubborn refusal to believe that my sister would allow anyone to humiliate me at her wedding. That was my mistake. After 27 years of protecting Sarah, supporting her, putting her needs ahead of my own, I had earned the right to expect the same protection in return. But somewhere in the glitter and glamour of her new life, Sarah had forgotten what loyalty meant. She had forgotten who I was and what I'd sacrificed for her. The music was still playing when everything changed. Sarah was radiant, dancing with her new husband, surrounded by friends and family. I was watching from my table, genuinely happy for her despite my growing unease about the evening's undercurrents. For just a moment, she was my sister again, the girl who had shared secrets and dreams with me, who had once made me feel like the most important person in her world. Then the music stopped, and she walked toward the microphone. Sarah's transformation had been subtle, happening over months and years as Derek's world slowly became her world. His friends, his values, his casual dismissal of anything that didn't serve their narrow definition of success. I had watched it happen without fully understanding what I was seeing. The sister who had once been proud of my achievements had learned to see them as embarrassing reminders of a life she wanted to leave behind. But I still hadn't anticipated this. Even as I felt the growing chill from her new crowd, even as I recognized that I no longer fit into the life she was building, I never imagined she would sacrifice me so publicly, so brutally, on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. The microphone feedback squealed as she adjusted it. The room fell quiet, everyone turning to look at the radiant bride who had something to say. Sarah's smile was bright and confident as she looked out at her guests, Derek's wealthy friends, his prominent family, the network of connections that represented her new future. When her eyes found mine, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Not love, not gratitude, not the sisterly affection that had defined our relationship for decades. I saw calculation. I saw someone who had made a choice about which version of herself she wanted to be, and I wasn't part of that equation. The words that came next would change everything between us forever. But in that moment before she spoke, I was still the loyal sister, still the woman who had spent her life protecting Sarah from consequences and cleaning up her messes. I was still naive enough to believe that love and sacrifice created unbreakable bonds, that family meant something more than social convenience. I learned differently in the next 60 seconds. I learned that some betrayals are so complete, so calculated, that they destroy not just relationships, but entire understandings of who you are and what you're worth. I learned that sometimes the people you love most are capable of hurting you in ways you never imagined possible. But I also learned something else that night, something Sarah and her new friends couldn't have anticipated. I learned that true strength isn't about avoiding humiliation. It's about how you respond when someone tries to destroy you in front of a room full of strangers. I learned that real power doesn't come from social connections or wealthy friends. It comes from earning the respect of people who understand honor, courage, and sacrifice. Sarah was about to discover that lesson herself, in ways she never could have predicted. But first, she had to finish what she'd started. She had to complete the betrayal that would define both our futures and teach us both what loyalty really meant. The microphone crackled as she began to speak, and I realized that everything I'd believed about family, about love, about the bonds between sisters, was about to be tested in the most public and painful way possible. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, Sarah began, her voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom. Her smile was radiant, the picture of bridal happiness. This has been the most amazing day of my life, and having all of you here to celebrate with Derek and me means the world. The guests murmured approval, champagne glasses catching the light as people settled in to listen to what they assumed would be a standard bride speech. Sweet thanks, maybe a funny story, certainly nothing that would disturb the elegant atmosphere of this expensive reception. Sarah's eyes swept the room, lingering on Derek's parents at their prominent table, on his business partners and their perfectly dressed wives, on the influencers and minor celebrities who had elevated this wedding from family celebration to social event. When her gaze reached me, sitting at a table near the back with some distant cousins, her smile shifted almost imperceptibly. I've been thinking a lot lately about how far I've come, she continued. About the journey that brought me to Derek, to this beautiful life we're building together. And I realize I need to be honest about something. The room grew quieter. This was departing from the usual script. Derek looked puzzled but amused, probably thinking his new wife was about to share some charming anecdote about their courtship. Growing up, my family didn't have much. We were perfectly ordinary people from a perfectly ordinary town. My parents worked hard, but we never had the kind of sophistication or worldliness that I see in this room tonight. She paused, letting that sink in. Several of Derek's friends exchanged knowing looks. This was the kind of brutal honesty they appreciated. Acknowledgement of class differences, admission of social climbing. My sister Gemma is here tonight, Sarah continued, and my stomach began to clench with dread. She's sitting right over there. A few heads turned toward me. I felt my face flush, but kept my expression neutral. Gemma has always been the responsible one in our family. The one who followed the rules, who chose a stable career, who never took any real risks. The word stung, but I told myself she was just setting up some kind of affectionate sister story. Sarah had always been dramatic. Maybe this was her way of thanking me for everything I'd done for her, for the months of wedding planning and financial support and endless emotional availability. She joined the military right out of college, Sarah said, and I heard the slight dismissal in her tone. It's been her whole life ever since. Very rigid, very structured, very predictable. A few people chuckled. Derek's mother nodded approvingly, as if Sarah was finally acknowledging something everyone had been thinking. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but stayed silent. This was still salvageable. Sarah could turn this around, make it about growth and different paths leading to the same place. The thing is, Sarah continued, I've realized that I spent too many years letting other people's limitations hold me back. Letting family obligations and guilt keep me from pursuing what I really wanted. My blood went cold. I understood now where this was heading, but I still couldn't quite believe it. Not here. Not in front of all these people. Not on her wedding day. Gemma has always been, well, let's call it carefully managed in her ambitions. She's the kind of person who's satisfied with a steady paycheck and following orders. And for a long time, I let her convince me that was enough. That wanting more was somehow wrong. The room was completely silent now. Derek looked uncomfortable, probably beginning to realize this wasn't the charming family story he'd expected. But Sarah's new friends were riveted. This was exactly the kind of ruthless social positioning they understood and admired. I love my sister, Sarah said, and the words felt like a slap. But I've learned that you can't let other people's small dreams limit your own possibilities. Sometimes you have to be brave enough to outgrow the people who raised you. The cruelty of it took my breath away. 27 years of love and support, of putting her needs ahead of my own, of believing that family meant something sacred and unbreakable, all of it reduced to small dreams and limitations that she'd courageously overcome. But she wasn't finished. The worst was still coming. Tonight is about celebrating new beginnings, Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as she committed fully to her chosen narrative. It's about having the courage to surround yourself with people who inspire you to be your best self, who understand that success isn't just about security, it's about excellence. She looked directly at me then, her smile sharp and cold. So while some people are content to spend their lives taking orders on government ships, making tiny salaries and pretending that's somehow heroic, I've chosen to build something bigger. Something that matters. The room erupted in gasps and uncomfortable murmurs. Even Derek's friends, accustomed to casual cruelty, seemed shocked by the viciousness of the attack. I felt all eyes turning toward me, felt the weight of 300 people's pity and embarrassment pressing down on my shoulders. But the strangest thing happened in that moment. Instead of shame, I felt something closer to clarity. The sister I'd loved and protected for decades, the woman I'd sacrificed for and supported through every crisis and setback, had just revealed herself to be someone I barely recognized. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it almost felt like relief. Sarah was still talking, something about gratitude and new chapters, but I stopped listening. I sat perfectly still in my chair, my military training keeping my posture erect and my expression composed, while everyone around me whispered and stared and tried to figure out how to react to what they'd just witnessed. I thought about all the times I'd covered for her, all the money I'd sent, all the late-night phone calls when she'd needed someone to believe in her dreams. I thought about the promotion I'd earned just days before this wedding, the captain's bars that represented years of hard work and sacrifice and leadership that Sarah had just dismissed as taking orders and tiny salaries. Most of all, I thought about the 250 Navy SEALs currently stationed at the base just 40 minutes away, men and women I'd had the honor of commanding during joint operations, warriors who understood what real service and sacrifice looked like. People who would be appalled by what had just happened in this ballroom. Sarah finally finished her speech to scattered, uncomfortable applause. She handed the microphone back to the DJ and returned to Derek's side, looking flushed and triumphant. She'd made her choice, drawn her lines, decided which version of herself she wanted to be going forward. She'd also made the biggest mistake of her life. But she wouldn't understand that for another few minutes. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled. The conversations around me died as people watched to see how I would react to my sister's public humiliation. Would I cry? Would I storm out? Would I create a scene that would give them even more to talk about? Instead, I walked calmly to the ladies' room, pulled out my phone, and sent a single text message to my executive officer. Emergency family situation. Need immediate assistance at the Ritz-Carlton ballroom. Dress uniforms. Full honor guard. The response came back within seconds. Roger that, Captain. ETA 15 minutes. I splashed cold water on my face, checked my appearance in the mirror, and returned to the ballroom. Sarah was dancing with Derek again, surrounded by his friends who were probably congratulating her on her brutal honesty and social courage. The guests had returned to their conversations, though many were still shooting glances in my direction. I resumed my seat and waited. 15 minutes in military time meant 15 minutes exactly. I'd trained these sailors myself. I knew they wouldn't be late. The first sign was the sound of marching feet in the hotel corridor outside. Precise, synchronized steps that any veteran would recognize instantly. The conversations in the ballroom began to falter as people tried to identify the sound. Then the doors opened, and 250 Navy SEALs in full dress uniforms marched into the ballroom in perfect formation. The effect was immediate and stunning. 300 wedding guests fell completely silent as these warriors filed in, their movements crisp and professional, their presence filling the room with an authority that no amount of wealth or social status could match. The music stopped abruptly. Sarah and Derek froze on the dance floor, her face going white as she realized what was happening. The SEALs continued their entrance, forming precise lines along the walls, their bearing impeccable and their silence absolute. Finally, when every SEAL was in position, their commanding officer stepped forward. His voice carried clearly across the stunned ballroom as he called out the words that would change everything. Admiral on deck. The lie was necessary and forgivable under the circumstances. I wasn't an admiral, not yet. But in that moment, surrounded by the men and women who understood what honor actually meant, the title felt less like a deception than a prophecy. Every SEAL in the room snapped to attention and rendered a perfect salute. The precision was breathtaking, 250 hands moving as one in a display of respect and solidarity that no civilian in that room had ever witnessed. I rose from my chair and returned their salute, my movements steady and sure. The woman Sarah had just described as someone with small dreams who was satisfied with taking orders was receiving the highest honor these elite warriors could offer. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Derek's wealthy friends, who had been laughing at military service just minutes before, now found themselves face to face with the reality of what that service actually meant. Sarah stood frozen on the dance floor, her mouth open in shock, finally understanding the magnitude of what she'd just thrown away. But I wasn't looking at her anymore. My attention was focused on the SEALs, on the respect in their eyes, on the acknowledgement of shared sacrifice and mutual understanding that no amount of social climbing could ever replicate. This was what real power looked like. Not the artificial authority that came from marrying well or surrounding yourself with wealthy friends, but the genuine respect earned through years of service, leadership, and dedication to something larger than yourself. Sarah had just learned the difference in the most public and humiliating way possible. But her education was far from over. The real consequences of her betrayal were just beginning. The formal display lasted exactly 60 seconds. Then, with the same precision they'd shown entering, the SEALs executed a perfect about-face and marched out of the ballroom, leaving behind a room full of people who would never forget what they'd just witnessed. I remained standing for a moment longer, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for everyone except me. Then I picked up my purse, smoothed my dress, and began walking toward the exit. Derek's mother found her voice first. "Wait," she called out. "What? Who are you exactly?" I paused at the doorway and turned back to face the room. Sarah was still frozen on the dance floor, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood what she'd lost. When I spoke, my voice was calm and clear, carrying easily to every corner of the ballroom. "I'm Captain Gemma Owens, United States Navy. I've served 3 combat deployments, commanded joint operations with Special Forces units, and been decorated for valor under fire. I hold advanced degrees in strategic studies and international relations." I paused, letting that information sink in before delivering the final line. And until tonight, I was proud to call Sarah my sister. The door closed behind me with a soft click, cutting off the chaos that erupted in my wake. I walked through the hotel lobby with my head high, ignoring the stares of other guests who had clearly heard about the drama upstairs. Outside, my driver was waiting, my executive officer, who had coordinated the entire operation with military efficiency. As we pulled away from the hotel, I caught a glimpse of wedding guests spilling onto the sidewalk, everyone talking at once, phones out as they shared the story that would dominate social media for weeks. "Well executed, XO," I said quietly. "Thank you, Captain." The team was honored to serve. That was all that needed to be said. These sailors understood loyalty, understood the bonds forged through shared sacrifice and mutual respect. They had seen a shipmate under attack and responded without hesitation, not because they were ordered to, but because it was the right thing to do. Sarah had spent the evening trying to impress people with money and connections, people who would forget her name as soon as she stopped being useful to them. Meanwhile, I had just received the highest honor that warriors can bestow on each other, the acknowledgement of shared commitment to something greater than personal ambition. As we drove through the city, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. The sister I'd loved was gone, had probably been disappearing for years as Derek's world slowly consumed her original self. But the woman who had betrayed me so publicly tonight was a stranger, someone whose approval I no longer needed or wanted. Sarah had made her choice. Now she would live with the consequences. And I would build my life around people who understood what real strength looked like, who valued honor over status, who knew the difference between taking orders and providing leadership. The betrayal still hurt. It probably always would. But it had also freed me from a relationship that had become toxic without my realizing it. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who limit us most, not through malice, but through their inability to see beyond their own needs and fears. Tonight, Sarah had done me a favor. She'd shown me exactly who she was and exactly what our relationship meant to her. Now I could stop wasting energy on someone who saw my achievements as embarrassments and my sacrifices as character flaws. I had a career to focus on, real friends who respected me, and a future that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. For the first time in years, I felt completely free. The next few weeks were a masterclass in social consequences. The video, of course, went viral within hours. Someone at the wedding had live-streamed the entire event, capturing Sarah's speech, my dignified silence, and the spectacular entrance of the SEALs. By morning, it had been viewed millions of times under hashtags like #RealRespect and #SisterRevenge. But the social media attention was just the beginning. Derek's business partners, who had initially been amused by Sarah's willingness to throw her family under the bus, began to reconsider what that behavior revealed about her character. If she could betray a sister who had supported her for decades, what did that say about her trustworthiness and other relationships? The first crack appeared when Derek's biggest client, a defense contractor who employed several military veterans, pulled his account after seeing the video. He made it clear that he couldn't work with a company whose leadership showed such disrespect for military service. Other clients followed. The viral nature of the story meant that Sarah's wedding speech had become a case study in professional reputation management, specifically, how to destroy one in less than 5 minutes. Derek's business, which relied heavily on personal relationships and trust, began hemorrhaging clients who didn't want to be associated with the controversy. Meanwhile, my own career received an unexpected boost. The Navy, which had been following the story with interest, fast-tracked my promotion timeline. Apparently, my composed response to a hostile situation had impressed some very senior officers who understood the leadership qualities required to maintain dignity under fire. I was offered command of a new joint task force, a position that would put me on track for admiral within 5 years. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah's attempt to diminish my achievements had actually accelerated them. But the professional consequences were nothing compared to what was happening in Sarah's personal life. Derek, who had initially supported his wife's honesty about her family background, began to realize how the situation was affecting his standing in the community. His mother, a woman who valued social position above all else, was mortified by the negative attention. The pressure on their marriage was immediate and intense. Derek's friends, who had applauded Sarah's ruthlessness when it was directed at someone they didn't know, became uncomfortable when they realized how easily she might turn on them. Trust, once broken, couldn't be restored with explanations or apologies. I watched it all unfold from a distance, receiving updates from mutual friends who felt compelled to keep me informed. Part of me felt sorry for Sarah, despite everything she'd done. She had achieved the social acceptance she'd craved, only to discover that it came with conditions she hadn't anticipated. But mostly, I felt relief. The sister I'd tried so hard to protect and support had revealed herself to be someone I barely recognized. The woman who could stand up at her own wedding and publicly humiliate someone who had loved her unconditionally wasn't someone worth grieving. My parents tried to mediate, of course. They called repeatedly, suggesting that family should forgive family, that the whole situation had been blown out of proportion by social media. But they hadn't been in that ballroom. They hadn't felt the calculation behind Sarah's words, hadn't seen the look in her eyes as she chose her new identity over 27 years of sisterly devotion. I declined their invitations to family dinners where Sarah would be present. I returned her wedding gift unopened. I changed my emergency contact information and removed her from my social media accounts. The woman who had once been my closest confidant became a stranger I had no interest in knowing. The transformation was liberating. Without the constant drain of Sarah's crises and demands, I had energy for my own goals and relationships. I started dating again, something I'd neglected while managing her endless dramatic emergencies. I took up hobbies I'd abandoned, traveled to places I'd only dreamed about. Most importantly, I invested in relationships with people who valued the same things I did: integrity, service, loyalty. My social circle became smaller, but infinitely stronger. These were people who understood that real friendship meant standing by each other during difficult times, not throwing each other overboard when it became socially convenient. 3 months after the wedding, Derek filed for divorce. The business losses had been too severe, the social damage too extensive. His family's reputation in their wealthy enclave had been permanently tarnished by association with Sarah's viral infamy. Sarah tried to fight the divorce, hiring expensive lawyers she couldn't afford, making public statements about being abandoned in her time of need. But the prenup was ironclad, and Derek's legal team had no difficulty documenting the professional damage her actions had caused. She was left with nothing: no marriage, no money, no social standing, and a reputation that made her virtually unemployable in Los Angeles. The acting career she'd pursued for years was effectively over, since casting directors could Google her name and find the wedding video within seconds. I heard she moved back to our hometown, living with our parents while she figured out her next steps. The woman who had been so eager to escape her ordinary origins found herself right back where she'd started, but without the sister who had always been there to help her rebuild. Our parents begged me to reach out, to offer some kind of support during her difficult transition. They couldn't understand why I wouldn't help someone who was clearly suffering, even if she had made mistakes. But they were thinking in terms of ordinary sibling rivalry or momentary poor judgment. What Sarah had done wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated betrayal that revealed the person she had always been underneath the surface. The sister who could smile at me while planning my public humiliation wasn't someone who deserved my trust, no matter how much she was suffering now. I had learned something valuable about the difference between loyalty and enabling, between family love and self-respect. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let someone face the consequences of their choices without rushing to cushion the impact. Sarah had wanted to prove she was better than her family background, that she deserved a more sophisticated life than the one she'd grown up with. She'd succeeded, in a way, but not how she'd planned. She'd definitely outgrown her old life, but the new one she'd built had collapsed under the weight of her own character flaws. Meanwhile, I was thriving in ways I'd never imagined possible. The respect I'd earned through years of service and sacrifice had proven far more valuable than any social connections or wealthy marriages. The bonds forged with fellow service members, based on shared commitment and mutual trust, had given me a foundation that couldn't be shaken by family drama or social media controversies. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't managing someone else's crisis or cleaning up someone else's mess. I wasn't sacrificing my own goals to support someone else's dreams. I was free to pursue my own ambitions, surrounded by people who celebrated my achievements instead of resenting them. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been educational. I'd learned that real strength isn't about avoiding conflict or maintaining relationships at any cost. Sometimes it's about having the courage to walk away from people who don't value what you bring to their lives. Sarah had taught me that lesson in the most painful way possible. But she had taught me, and for that I supposed I should be grateful. The sister I'd lost hadn't been real anyway. She'd been a projection of my own hopes and memories, not the person Sarah had actually become. Now I was building a life based on reality instead of wishful thinking, surrounded by people who understood the difference between loyalty and exploitation. It was a much better life than the one I'd been living before, even if it had taken a wedding disaster to show me the way forward. 2 years later, I was promoted to Rear Admiral, the youngest woman in Navy history to achieve that rank. The ceremony was held at the Naval Academy, surrounded by colleagues who had supported my career and respected my leadership. As I took the oath and received my new insignia, I thought briefly about Sarah, about how she would have reacted to this moment in the old days. But those thoughts were fleeting. The people who mattered were there with me, celebrating an achievement that represented years of hard work and sacrifice. My parents attended, proud despite their lingering sadness about the family rift. Several of the SEALs from that memorable wedding night were present in their dress uniforms, their respect and admiration clear. The reception afterward was elegant but relaxed, filled with genuine warmth and congratulations. These were relationships built on mutual respect and shared values, not the fragile social connections that Sarah had prioritized. When my colleagues raised their glasses to toast my promotion, I knew their admiration was based on my actual achievements, not my usefulness to their ambitions. Admiral Owens. It had a nice ring to it, I thought as I looked around the room at the people who had helped make this moment possible. Sarah had been right about one thing at her wedding. Sometimes you do have to be brave enough to outgrow the people who raised you, to surround yourself with those who inspire you to excellence. She'd just been wrong about which one of us was doing the outgrowing. During the toasts, my executive officer stood to speak about leadership and integrity, about the difference between commanding respect and demanding it. As he talked about the qualities that made someone worthy of following into battle, I realized how completely my understanding of power and success had evolved. Sarah had sought validation through wealth and status, through impressing people who valued appearance over substance. But real power came from earning the trust of people who understood sacrifice, who recognized leadership when they saw it, who chose to follow because they respected the person giving the orders. The wedding that was supposed to celebrate her arrival in high society had instead revealed the poverty of her character. Meanwhile, the humiliation she'd intended for me had become the catalyst for achievements she could never have imagined. After the reception, I stood on the academy grounds where I'd first learned about honor and duty. The sister who had once called this place weird would never understand what it had given me, not just a career, but a code of values that had sustained me through every challenge. I thought about the girl I'd been when I first arrived here, eager to please and desperate for approval, especially from the sister I'd idolized. That girl had been brave enough to pursue her dreams despite family skepticism, but she'd never learned to value her own achievements over other people's opinions. The woman I'd become understood that real validation comes from within, from knowing you've served something greater than yourself with honor and integrity. Sarah's betrayal had been painful, but it had also been liberating, freeing me from the need to earn love through endless sacrifice and accommodation. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, I wondered if it might be Sarah, reaching out after all this time. But it was from my newest assignment officer, congratulating me again and discussing logistics for my next command. No backward glances, I decided. The future was too bright and too full of possibility to waste time mourning relationships that had been built on unequal foundations. Sarah had made her choice that night at the Ritz-Carlton. Now I was living with the consequences of mine. As I walked back to my car, I felt nothing but gratitude for the path that had led me here. Even the painful parts, especially the painful parts, had taught me lessons I couldn't have learned any other way. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are also the ones who set us free, though rarely in the way they intend. Admiral Owens had a nice ring to it indeed. And unlike Sarah's brief moment of social triumph, this achievement was built on foundations that couldn't be shaken by family drama, social media storms, or the shifting loyalties of fair-weather friends. This was real, earned, and mine. I drove home through the city streets, past the hotel where my old life had ended and my real life had begun. The woman who had once defined herself through her sister's needs and crises was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to settle for anything less than genuine respect. Sarah had wanted to prove she was better than her family. In the end, she'd succeeded, just not in the way she'd planned. She'd shown me exactly how much better I could be without her holding me back, without her constant crises draining my energy and her resentment poisoning my achievements. For that lesson, painful as it had been to learn, I would always be grateful. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is showing you exactly who they are, clearly and unmistakably, so you can stop wasting time on illusions and start building something real. The future stretched ahead of me, full of challenges and opportunities and relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligatory loyalty. Sarah had done me a favor that night at her wedding, though she'd never intended it that way. She'd set me free to become the person I was always meant to be. And for the first time in years, I was excited to see where that journey would lead. That night taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. Real family lifts you up. They don't tear you down for applause. Sarah thought she was trading up, but she lost the one person who'd always had her back. Meanwhile, I found my true family, the men and women who understand honor, loyalty, and what it means to have someone's six. 2 years later, I'm Admiral Owens, surrounded by people who celebrate my wins instead of resenting them. Sarah? Last I heard, she's back in our hometown alone, learning the hard way that bridges you burn don't just disappear, they leave you stranded. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect? What was your 250 seals moment, that time when you finally stood up and showed someone who you really are? Drop your stories in the comments below. And tell me, do you think I was too harsh, or was this exactly what Sarah needed to learn? If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I share real stories about setting boundaries, choosing yourself, and what happens when people mistake your kindness for weakness. Thanks for listening, and remember, you teach people how to treat you. Make sure the lesson is worth learning.